You're listening to Owning the Buy Box, an IP Secure podcast. This is the podcast for agencies, brands, and aggregators who want to master Amazon, push out unauthorized competition, and take their business to the next level. You're about to hear a conversation that'll help you maximize your growth on Amazon by owning the Buy Box. Let's get into the show.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Owning the Buy Box. I am your host, Dave Cooper. I'm also the CEO and the founder of IP Secure. On the show, we like to talk about a variety of issues that impact brands and their ability to be successful on Amazon. And there's a variety of different techniques that brands use to really help protect their brand, protect their IP, secure the Amazon sales channel. And I'm really excited today because our guest is Ziyi Yang, who is a reporter focused on China for the MIT Technology Review. And Ziyi did a fantastic article really breaking down an area of litigation that has become more and more popular with brands. And this is counterfeit litigation that's being done against sellers on the Amazon platform. And it's a really interesting topic because, as we interview brands and agencies and people who sell on Amazon, this is becoming a bigger and bigger part of their strategy to not only protect their IP, but I think really protect what is becoming or has become the most valuable e-commerce sales channel that exists for a US brand today, right? Nothing is more important to them than Amazon. So I'm really excited to have Ziyi here with us. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Hi, David. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thanks for writing this really insightful article. I've been in the industry now for well over 20 years. And when I started, this was something that was done very rarely, and had usually considerable costs associated with it and complexity associated with it. And so it wasn't something that was used, I think with such a level of frequency. You wrote a fantastic breakdown of your perspective of what's happening in this area. What prompted you to sort of take a look at this space and take a look at this new legal strategy that seems to be, really exploding in popularity?
Sure. So as a bit of a background, I have been reporting on Chinese technology for the past 3 years, I think. And really what I love to report on is kind of the technology platforms or companies that connect China and the other countries in the world. So Amazon is a great example, right? Because you are seeing so many Chinese suppliers sell products to customers in the US or really across the world. So that's why it drew me to focus on, okay, so what is happening on Amazon? What are these Chinese sellers doing there? And because of that, a few years ago, I think maybe like 2 years ago, I started to see. I think maybe like 2 years ago, I saw a piece of news that's really interesting. It's just that they listed a few addresses in Chicago that they are warning Chinese sellers to caution against. It's like, wait, why are these addresses like wrong, or like why are Chinese sellers terrified of them? And then from there, I learned that there are a lot of American law firms, especially Chicago-based law firms. They're suing these Chinese sellers in mass, and that is the reason why they're actually kind of like this service articles compiling these addresses for the law firms for Chinese sellers. Wow! And then from there,
where did you see that initially? Was it Weibo? Was it a platform in China that people were discussing this?
Well, because the kind of the cross-border e-commerce industries in China is so big, there are websites dedicated to kind of serve them, like that websites that tell them, okay, what is selling hot in which country right now, or what are the rules, the new rules that Amazon has that the sellers need to navigate. So this is one of the information that's like, here's something that can help you better sell on Amazon. It's basically presented it that way.
Wow. So that's interesting. So you saw that there was discussion online right, by these, China-based Amazon sellers talking about, hey, if you get orders from Chicago, or stay away from Chicago, was sort of the message that they were sending, and they had specific addresses, and that is interesting. I could see why that would pique your interest.
Totally. So, I mean, I started just with like, so what is wrong with Chicago? Why do Chinese Amazon sellers fear them? But then it turns out this is just like a big, I don't know, empire of intellectual property lawsuits that it's really hard to entangle kind of the details of who's right, who's wrong in there. But that's why I spent probably the past year kind of like investigating what is really happening and breaking it down in that article.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because it's obviously, while it's growing large enough where it got your attention, it's gotten lots of people's attention. I know you interviewed a number of people for the article, all well aware that this has been going on for quite a while. So it's happening at a pretty high volume, big enough where we're kind of taking notice of it, but it still seems to be happening in really just a few places within the United States, at least at scale. Why Chicago? Any idea why Chicago? Is there something significant about that particular area?
That's really the most difficult questions in this case right now. And I don't think anyone has like the perfect answer for it, but I can try. So first of all, from a quantitative standpoint, right now, I believe it's like over 80% or like something about 90% of these cases, like intellectual cases, property cases, are filed within Chicago. That's interesting because counterfeits happen everywhere, and like consumers across the United States are buying counterfeit product. So why specifically Chicago do these law firms choose to file them in? One thing we are suspecting is that this kind of practice of mass suing Amazon sellers started by a few Chicago-based law firms. So it's natural that they will file in Chicago. But then what happens over the years is that it seems like the Chicago-based court, the federal court, is actually more lenient to these cases, or is more lenient to the plaintiffs. So they're requesting less due diligence. They may award higher compensation. And that just draws all the law firms to come here to say, well, if I'm going to file this somewhere in the United States, filing in Chicago seems to be the most ideal option for me and for my client. So that's now. So that's why I guess a lot of them are doing that in Chicago right now. And as long as that doesn't change, as long as the Chicago court doesn't turn out one day to say, well, we're not accepting these cases anymore, I think that's going to continue.
Yeah. So it's I guess maybe it's happenstance, right? The initial firms that really thought about launching this type of litigation did it in their local jurisdiction, and I would think probably the brands too, right? Were probably somewhere in that part of the country, and it worked. And so when something works, people take notice and they want to, of course, replicate it. And why take your chances in another jurisdiction, right? If you've already got some precedent in that Illinois district. So that's interesting. I mean, I think, I mean, there has to be some real relevance to it. Otherwise, we would, I think, probably see these cases get filed in hundreds of different places around the country, and we're just simply not seeing that, to your point. So there's obviously something about that jurisdiction in particular that makes these cases, more successful. And to your point, why would a brand take a chance going elsewhere? I think this is super interesting considering how much effort Amazon has spent over the years recruiting sellers from China. Right? I mean, not many platforms have done as much as Amazon has to expand their reach globally. Walmart did the same a couple of years ago, if you remember, and they made a big effort to go out to China as well. So, Amazon is sort of aggressively recruiting sellers from all over the world, but a lot of them from China. And telling them, come to our platform, sell here, right? We want you to be successful. As a matter of fact, we're going to give you a bunch of tools and we're going to help you be successful. They run seminars there. They do a lot, right, to help reach the audience in China, the seller audience. But then all of a sudden, they get clobbered And it just seems to me like this type of litigation, while successful, feels wrong. And again, that's just my personal perspective. But like, for instance, I know you spoke with Eric Goldman, right, for your article, who
Yes.
is a university professor at the School of Law in Santa Clara, and he talked about a German company that I think has a trademark for emoji, and he estimated that I think that they sued like over 10,000 sellers over a couple years, that were selling products that use the word emoji or the trademark emoji. And that just seems astonishing to me. That seems like a massive amount of litigation. That's 10,000 sellers. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, first of all, I don't think most people realize that emoji is a trademark term. And then realizing that just like including the word emoji in your product listing on Amazon and e-commerce website can be grounds for a company based in Germany to sue you and get a lot of compensation from it.
And what's weird is the companies in Germany, the sellers in China or wherever. I mean, I don't think that Eric was clear. There's a lot of sellers, right, so we don't know where they all are. But I think we can assume that a lot of those 231 sellers were not in the United States. That's probably a safe assumption. So we've got a foreign company suing foreign sellers on U.S. soil. It's weird.
Yeah, I mean, the main reason why is that Amazon is an American company, and to kind of like get Amazon and not other popular platforms to comply with this kind of intellectual property, the cases, it's to file the case in the United States. But then you are right that like Amazon, or the kind of like platform model that Amazon really succeeded in, it's special because like it connects so many different kind of like players around the world. You have companies who may hold intellectual property, like a German company. You have factories and manufacturers in China who are selling this kind of products and marketing them on Amazon. And then you have consumers in the United States buying this product. So Amazon really built this like global empire for e-commerce. And then because like right now all the intellectual property laws are mostly based on national laws, so there isn't really kind of like a good way for them to fix that within the country's borders, so that becomes a really complicated cross-border legal issue too. And Amazon just, or companies like Amazon just have to be at the center of this, but they have to kind of like figure out how to respond to this the emerging trend of legal cases.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the other thing that these law firms have figured out is that the money lives in really two places, right? The money lives on Amazon.
That's
because
true.
they're handling the payments, they're moving the money around, and then the money also lives in the seller's bank account. But that's much harder to get to,
exactly.
Right? It's much harder to identify that, and I would think a court. I don't want to speak for the court, but I would just assume that the level of evidence required to freeze an FDIC insured bank account at a U.S. bank is probably a little bit higher than sending a temporary restraining order to Amazon.
Yeah.
Right. So it becomes low hanging fruit. It really becomes a game of how much money do they have in their Amazon account, because that's inevitably what we're going to try to collect and try to freeze.
Yeah.
And I know that some platforms over the years have extended the window where they force sellers to keep money in there, right? Like I remember 10 years ago, if you sold on eBay, you could sweep your account like every 24 hours, just about, right? So there was very little money that was sitting inside of eBay's systems, or PayPal, I guess at that time. I don't know. And they, over the years, have broadened that window. And I think primarily to aid brand owners in this type of legal tactic, right? Because the longer the money sits there, the higher the likelihood is that the brand owner could have a successful action and and collect or at least freeze those funds. So it's really interesting how some of those different little changes, may be part of the story, overall. And yeah, it just fascinates me, the level of aggressiveness and key words. Like, to your point, I thought the really cool part, like one of the cool parts about your article, was the part about, and I forgot her name, but she had used the word airbag, right, in some of her listings.
Yes.
So if I'm a seller, I'm terrified now of what keywords I might be using, right? Because you don't know, anything could be a trademark.
Yeah,
it's really incredible.
Yeah. Just to recap a little bit, so you're talking about a Chinese-based seller on Amazon. She sells kind of like mostly phone cases or phone accessories, and then airbag is the word that she used to describe kind of the little air bumper cushions near the on the side of the phone case, so that when it falls, it helps protect the phone. Then, well, she didn't realize this word could be trademarked. I don't think most people will realize that, but then it did, and it was trademarked, I think, in 2021 by a very prominent phone case company. So what happened is that because she listed the product after November 2021, the company sued her for using the trademark case, basically to deceive consumers into believing like the phone case that she is selling is also from this American company. Obviously, she doesn't think that's the case. She is not intending to kind of like write on that trademark at all. But then that's kind of like the legal base for filing this case against her. And yeah, I think that is one part of this big group of property cases. It's just that sometimes the intellectual property is very hard to recognize, and for someone, an Amazon seller in a different country speaking a different language, it's pretty hard for them to recognize the risks in there. Like in this case, she specifically says that because she feels like this is like a very generic term, she did not bother looking that up in the trademark database, and that's what resulted in kind of her being involved in this case.
Yeah, I could totally understand that. I mean, I was reading some commentary online this morning from another sort of expert in the space who flat out said he felt like these law firms were targeting Chinese sellers specifically because they may not understand how to identify U.S. trademarks that to them seem like just common language that everybody's using. So your point's well made, which is, if so many of these are directed towards sellers in China, look, counterfeits come from lots of places. I get that. And I'm sure if we looked at a chart, I think you even had a statistic in there that said, I think 60% of what customs was seizing at the border that they classified as counterfeit was coming from China. So I get it. That's a fair, I think, perspective, but there could be a little bit more going on here, right? There could be a little bit of taking advantage of these sellers and merchants because they don't, English is not their first language. They don't have real deep knowledge of the U.S. trademark system and how that works, and that makes them excellent targets. So it's unfortunate because I think that sellers in China actually play a vital role in the ecosystem that is Amazon. And I realize they get a lot of bad press because the brands, are constantly looking to police and stop things and everything's bad. But the reality is for the average consumer, they create an environment on Amazon that has unlimited selection of choice and price point and quality. And that is something that consumers love and appreciate, whether they realize it or not, right? Nobody wants to go to Amazon and only have one option to buy. So I think U.S. Brands should and consumers should be careful that we don't put too much of the blame on the Chinese seller, because the reality is they are playing a vital role in the health of the ecosystem in terms of giving us, choice and access to product at price points that we would not have access to otherwise.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think currently, like Amazon, like Chinese sellers are just like an indisposable part of Amazon. The reason why all kinds of products can be sold at a cheaper price on Amazon compared to a lot of the brick and mortar stores is because Amazon is directly sourcing from China. They're skipping over kind of like the brand part of it. They're skipping over a lot of the costs that occur in a traditional kind of selling process. So that's why people are enjoying the benefit of like buying the same thing for a cheaper price. But that also produce a lot of more problems right now because you're directly engaging with a Chinese-based factory, a Chinese-based company. How do you communicate with them? The U.S. the U.S. legal system on like intellectual property and everything. There's just so many new problems that needs to be solved to make sure that like the system is still working well. No one's intellectual property is being infringed, and also people can still source buy cheap products. I feel like we're just still in the process of figuring that out. Amazon's Chinese sellers, brands, they're all figuring that out. But this case is just one particular process that have gone wrong for a bit in the past. But yeah, I'm sure like all of them will try to see where they can go from here.
Yeah. Is there, so it sounds like there's awareness of this type of lawsuit and strategy within the sort of seller community within China, right? Like you said, there's a lot of, websites and content and things that are being directed towards that seller community, right? We can help you sell more. We can help you be successful. True. Tips and tricks. So it sounds like there's a lot of sharing of information going on within this community. I mean, what's the sentiment? Do sellers in China care about this? Is this kind of a rare thing still? Or are they like legitimately concerned and you think taking steps to like avoid detection or kind of, stay under the radar?
Right. I think this is something that most Chinese-based e-commerce sellers will have heard of, at least. But the thing is, until it really happens to them, they might not care too much about it because they will say, well, this is just like a luck thing, right? Like someone's unlucky and they got targeted. I do see a bit of more kind of like organizing happening in that space. There are kind of like industry associations representing these Chinese sellers. They're trying to see, okay, is it possible we kind of like bring a legal case against these law firms and plaintiffs? Or is it possible we at least educate on the Chinese sellers on like, how do you check the trademarks? How do you make sure you are not infringing someone's intellectual property? So that is happening too. But I feel that overall, there's still kind of like divide between the Chinese community and the American Amazon community, to the sense that they feel like, okay, even if the Chinese sellers feel they have been unfairly targeted in this kind of cases, they do not know where to seek legal help. They do not know how to find other sellers who have been experienced the same, and that really just put them into like a very individualized situation. Some of them may not have like even told anyone about they are under this kind of lawsuit. So right now they're still kind of like in the very early age of like organizing and trying to respond to this.
Yeah, because I think, that's interesting. I would keep an eye on that. To me, that's a follow-up story in the future because the power of, the seller community in China, if they were to join forces and, like to your point, maybe create some US-based association, that is maybe funded through the activity of these Chinese sellers to defend their rights to be there, to defend them when they are caught in the crosshairs, that's going to happen because there's too much money at stake here. And I can see that, progressing over the years to come, because right now it's very difficult. I mean, I even as a U.S. citizen, and I've been involved in the legal industry for 25 years, and I'm still surprised at some of the things that I see. For instance, I didn't realize that, like defendants, their identities in many cases are just completely hidden, right? Until their bank account's frozen. Yeah. So they may not even know that they're being sued.
Right. This is a very interesting design of this case is actually, which is also why how it's kind of like different from a lot of the previous intellectual property lawsuits. It's
Yeah.
just that when kind of like dozens or hundreds of sellers are being named in one case, their name, their storefronts is completely confidential until kind of like at a very late stage of the lawsuit when they decide to declassify these documents. So if you are someone who is being sued in this kind of cases, you are only going to get a email telling you that, okay, you are being involved in this lawsuit. And a lot of the China-based sellers never check their emails that frequently. And that is why they only realize that until their stores are being frozen by Amazon, which is usually about like 1 week or two after they got the email. That is why kind of like these cases move at a really fast speed, and also it's like pretty discreetly too. So the sellers don't have a lot of time to respond, like before a trial or something. And also like because of the physical distance, right? They cannot just fly to the United States and appear in a court. If they haven't really hired any US-based attorneys before, that also requires a lot of time. So the whole process, I would say, it's more advantageous to the plaintiff than to the defendants who are usually based in China.
Yeah, I mean, you may have like 2 weeks, it sounds like, right? From the time that, you first, are made aware of this to the time that you need to potentially show up at a court hearing. That just seems crazy. So there's anonymity involved. There's a massive amount of speed, which you don't see in other types of litigation here in the United States, right? Everything takes forever here. I mean, the simplest legal process here, right, takes forever. So they've really figured out how to create an environment where they can, mass produce these litigations, these lawsuits at a pretty massive scale. Amazon continues to be the system that feeds these new targets to them, knowingly or unknowingly. And I'll go back to that too, because we talked about keywords. Amazon could solve this, right? If Amazon said, hey, we're going to scan every new product listing before it goes up, and we're going to compare it to a database of the USPTO trademarks, which is totally available, right? Electronically. Many companies can tap into that. That's not new. This is small potatoes for Amazon from a technology standpoint, right? I mean, they could do this over the weekend probably if they chose to, but they choose not to, because you know why? Nobody's going to buy a product from a listing if the brand name is not in the title, right? Or if the image isn't a legitimate image. If it's a Polaroid of a product in your basement, nobody's going to buy it. So they're stuck between, we could solve this problem in an instant, but we don't want to create an environment where, these listings are undesirable and the sellers in China are no longer successful because they can't put the brand name of the product that they're selling. That also seems like really probably not a good strategy. But it's interesting. We're going to do an episode in a couple of weeks with another gentleman who's an expert on Section 230. And because part of this discussion is part of 230 as well, which is, how much should Amazon be doing, right? To help. Amazon's the one who's recruiting all the sellers, and they're bringing together the players that are creating this issue. I would think they probably want a little bit more skin in the game as it relates to trying to stop this, personally.
Yeah, and I think one interesting point I heard from one of the academics I talked to for this story is that no one's really winning in these kind of cases, like in the case of Amazon counterfeit products, because the brands feel like it's hard for them to defend their rights. It's hard for them to kind of hold the counterfeiters accountable. And then the sellers feel like they're being unfairly targeted, maybe just because they're Chinese, maybe just because they used a word that could be a trademark. I think the key to that is that Amazon is because the business innovation that Amazon has done, it has created a lot of like new legal challenges, but itself is not really reacting to them. It's more kind of like putting the sellers against each other to figure this out. So that's why I do think why I'm seeing some sellers and some academics ask for Amazon to take more stance, take a more active stance in here, because like you are part of the problem and you should kind of take a responsibility to fix it.
Who is in your buy box? That's the key question and the difference between sales growth and brand abuse and revenue loss. Monitoring your buy box is the key to brand protection success on Amazon. At IP Secure, our analytics will drive your behavior. It's not about taking down more sellers, removing more unauthorized listings. It's about knowing who's taking your revenue minute by minute, and then adjusting your response appropriately, taking action when necessary, and recapturing that revenue. Visit us today, ipsecure.com. Learn how. Well, that's the key word there, is responsibility.
Right.
And I think there's Amazon needs to sort of split the issue in two, because they don't want to completely own the issue,
right?
But they can't completely turn their backs on it either, right? And that's kind of the heart of 230, is like, how much responsibility does Amazon have to help resolve the problems that are happening as a consequence of their business? And they would probably tell you, very little, very few.
Yeah.
But I can understand their perspective as well, because it's a slippery slope. When we start making them responsible for everything, where does it end? And then, of course, innovation stops. Their business will slow. Amazon provides an amazingly valuable service, and so we shouldn't discount that. They're not the bad guys here, but I do think there needs to be a framework for more transparency. Like, I'm okay with all this stuff going on. I just don't want to feel like it's going on in the dark, right? And I feel like there should be more transparency on these things, so that the courts don't operate in a siloed environment, because that's what's happening. I spoke with other law firms, ones that were not mentioned in your article, ones that also do litigation in the counterfeit space, who feel like these strategies are I won't speak to the legality of them, but in their view, the word, like verbatim, unethical was the word that they used. Because when you file a lawsuit against hundreds of people collectively, the amount of due diligence that a firm would normally do in a case like that, it could be millions of dollars, right? If not hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we know that's not happening here. We just know it's not, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to produce these things in 2 weeks. It just wouldn't work that way. You know what I mean? So it's interesting. I'm very curious, and I don't expect you to have a real opinion on this. We're not lawyers, but this will have a legal consequence in the future. I don't know what it is, but it's either going to be good for the Chicago people, and maybe more jurisdictions will start adopting this and the liberal view of it, or it's going to go the other way and it's going to be bad. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I read in a Bloomberg article also about these cases is that I forgot the name, but one of the judges at the Chicago court actually started to question, like, why are they receiving so many similar cases and it's all like filed in the same court? So I believe at least there's some attention right now being paid to, like, is this okay? Should we look at whether something's problematic here? I mean, I don't really know what's going to be the outcome of it. Maybe after an assessment, they'll be like, yeah, it's okay. We should continue doing that. But then I feel like you said, more attention, more transparency to let the people involved decide whether this is okay or not. I think that's at least what we hope, like this kind of cases is going from here. The other thing is just that, like, I hope, like, at least with my article, it's possible to kind of like eliminate some of the information gaps here, that at least let the sellers know what is happening in the United States, what are these law firms doing, and how frequently have they been doing this. Let them know whether there are some academic or industry voices speaking against it, and also let other people, maybe like consumers, maybe my other people in the intellectual property field, know that this is happening, and they can probably decide to go in there and have to form their own opinion on whether this is right or wrong. I think overall that's gonna at least make the problem a little bit better.
Yeah. I haven't heard of a countersuit yet either. And have you heard of any legal action that's been sort of taken by the Chinese sellers involved?
I don't believe there's anything that's kind of like that has been successfully fought. In the case that I have followed, the seller of phone cases, she did bring up a countersuit after she was sued last year. But they eventually settled. So I don't think, and it's confidential of the settlement details. So I don't think there has been a case yet where kind of like the two sides really kind of like battle in courts about who is right or wrong in these cases.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because the example you gave in your article was a great example where I feel, like these sellers, they're targeting small sellers on purpose because they can't afford to fight back. It doesn't make sense. If you have $10,000 in your Amazon account, right, and it's frozen, but it's going to cost you $20,000 to deal with the litigation. Well, of course, you take the loss and you walk away because it's just a cost benefit analysis. Anyone can do that. And these law firms are not stupid. And so I feel like that to me is also something that I feel it doesn't feel quite ethical to me because the law firms may even have targets that they view as more egregious, selling more counterfeits, operating at a bigger scale. But those targets have lawyers. So we're not going to go after them because they're going to fight back. Now our 2-week litigation turns into 6 months. And then their cost benefit goes out the window because it's a business. And in the business is find targets who don't fight back, get their money quickly. So that to me is just unbelievable. I'd love to have some of those law firms on the show too, because I want to ask them, how does this make sense, right? From your perspective, I doubt they'd come on, but it would certainly it would be an interesting would be an interesting conversation. And your example about pop sockets, I mean, it's like, wow. If I was in China, I think I'd start a newsletter and tell people don't use these keywords in your listing, because you're going to get scooped up. And in my former life, I used to work at a company where we did very large scale monitoring and scraping and analysis. And I can tell you, most of those technologies are not very good. I mean, this is not your latest algorithm that's being used here. So their mistakes are made all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's unfortunate because clearly there can be real consequences.
Yeah. And also on that point, I don't know how it compares to the monitoring tools that you have used, but I have also heard that there are new AI companies who are kind of specializing in using their algorithm to identify trademark infringement specifically. So I do think some of the law firms are using that kind of technologies. Again, algorithms can be faulty. They can identify someone who's actually innocent. So we don't know how much due diligence is going in there to help clean up the results and to make sure that the algorithm is not just randomly naming people in the lawsuit. But yes, we are seeing brands also kind of depending on the help of AI technologies to help them name dozens or hundreds of defendants in one case.
Yeah. I can tell you from personal experience, a lot of them are not using anything other than a keyword search on Amazon.
Right.
As a matter of fact, they don't want to use anything that is too sophisticated because I think it might show them something that they would have a responsibility to evaluate, include, or at least make a decision on. So by using extremely elementary approaches to this, like they're only going to do as much due diligence as that Illinois court asks them to do, or that they expect to be forced into. And I have had conversations with some of these lawyers who tell me, yeah, we just go out to Amazon, we plug in the brand name, we look for any sellers in China, and we put them on a list. That's it. That is it. Now, I don't know that all law firms are doing it that way, but I know from my personal conversations and interactions with them that some of them are. And that's super scary to me, because if they can do that to sellers in China, they can do that to sellers anywhere. Yeah. The fact that they're in China is irrelevant. I mean, that just happens to be where they live. That has nothing to do with what's happening in that court in Illinois. So who's next? Is it sellers from Guatemala? Is it sellers from Canada? Like, I mean, they basically could do it against anyone who doesn't have the financial means or the education and intelligence about the system to fight back. And that feels wrong. That just feels wrong. So it's really interesting. The last piece that I was sort of curious about, because I heard about this recently, is, and you may or may not have an opinion on it, but I heard a lot of these law firms are doing this on contingency, which is super interesting to me, because they've eliminated what is historically the brand's, like biggest concern is like, well, litigation is expensive, right? I don't want to spend a lot of money, especially if we don't really know how much the person is selling and what the impact is, which they don't know. All they know is it's a seller in China who's got their brand. That's all they know. And I've heard that the firms that are growing the fastest in this space are doing it with a contingency model where they basically just keep most of the money that gets frozen and collected. To me, again, that is an interesting perspective, because it means that anyone can participate in this litigation, right? It's not just for the big brands.
This is also something that I have heard, but I have not been able to verify. I have reached out to both brands and the law firms to ask them how do they kind of make their financial agreement on the cost. But obviously, they did not get back to me on that. But I do think it's good to assume that there's some kind of motivation for the law firms to participate in this kind of cases, because the number of intellectual property law firms that are filing these suits in Chicago have been expanded a lot. And the lawyers who are in this field can tell you that right now there are a lot of new law firms recognizing kind of the benefits of filing these cases and joining in. So I think at least there's something that motivates them to all come here and spread this model of litigation. So I have heard of the contingency plan, but I just don't have an answer on that yet.
Well, of course. Yeah. I mean, I think, and that sort of intelligence for me usually comes from the brands.
Right.
Obviously, the law firms aren't going to run around and tell you how they charge their customers. But I know that, after 2 decades of working with brands, that ones that initially had said, well, we would never pay for this type of litigation, all of a sudden you're doing it now. And I'm like, well, why are you, what's changed? Well, what's changed, Dave, is there's no upfront cost. And if the law firm is not successful in freezing funds and collecting them, then they don't get paid. They don't get paid. So that's why I think you see this assembly line approach, so they can scale it, because it's all about volume, right? Because they can't go after the big sellers, because the big sellers are going to fight back, and that's not good. That blows up the whole model, right? So we got to find sellers who won't fight back, but still have money in their accounts. So that's really the small, maybe medium-sized sellers where litigation's too expensive, and I'm more willing to just walk away, right, and leave that money on the table. Super interesting and really relevant, and I think. I love the fact that you wrote the story. I think that you had a really educated and well-rounded perspective on it. And I thought I would encourage everybody out there who listens to our show, to follow you and your articles on the MIT Technology Review website. I think you're a really smart reporter doing really good work. Oh, my pleasure. And And I'd love to stay in touch with you, and maybe in the
course.
future we could do follow-up episodes, because like I said, I mean, I really feel like this story is just starting, right?
Yeah, I agree.
You know, and there may be a future chapter to this story, whether it's the response from the Chinese seller community would be really interesting to understand, or the long-term effects that this is going to have on both sort of e-commerce and litigation. Because e-commerce is such an important part because of its ability, I think, to, you know, anyone can participate in it. And to me, you know, this is something that we need to keep an eye on, because transparency is what's going to make this palatable for everybody, right?
I agree. And also, I forgot to mention this, but the other reason why I'm so interested in the e-commerce space is that a lot of people are talking about kind of the US-China decoupling, but then at least in this field, in e-commerce, it's really hard for that to happen. So I think US consumers are going to buy products from China for a long time to come. So that is why I think consumers also need to know that kind of like what's their real relationship with like Chinese technologies and technology companies, and to know that on the other end there are real humans there too, and some of them might be counterfeiters actually, but some of them are not, and they're also kind of unfairly targeted. So yeah, it's just, I think it's better for people to know more about kind of like what's happening on the other side of the e-commerce, the business, the supply chain that you're using, and that's how interconnected the technology world is right now.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I completely agree. Amazon has shrunk the universe to, you know, a tiny size where you can buy anything from anyone, anywhere in the world, typically have it at your front door within a couple days, maybe a little longer, but it's going to come pretty quick. And I think that, again, I love Amazon. I spend my life, you know, dealing with it, helping brands on it, doing a podcast about it. So I think the value it provides is immense. Right. And I love that. I mean, I love that I could buy a product from someone halfway around the world, you know, almost instantly without any friction at a really affordable price. That's a very positive service and a valuable service. But I agree with you. I think we need more reporters like you who are creating transparency, so that consumers understand, businesses understand, brands can coexist with Chinese sellers. They absolutely can. Everybody just needs to do it in a way that is transparent and puts the consumer first. This, to me, doesn't feel like putting the consumer first. This feels like putting law firms first. Because I can tell you right now, to me, there's going to be a long-term consequence here. And it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
Yeah,
so
totally.
Zaid, that's all the time we have today, but I really appreciate you coming on the show. This has been really educational. It's been you're a very interesting reporter doing really good work. And so, like I said, I really encourage everybody, you know, go to the MIT Tech Review, check out your other articles. Hopefully you don't mind if people maybe want to connect with you on LinkedIn so they can follow you. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And we'd love to have you back as well in the future, and maybe do a follow-up on this particular topic, because it is of such great interest, you know, to our listeners. So thank you so much, you know, for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. This has been a really interesting conversation.
So I'm Dave Cooper. This has been Owning the Buy Box. Thanks, everybody, for listening. You can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, all the major platforms where you do your podcast listening. You can also check me out. I'm Dave Cooper. I'm also the CEO and founder of IP Secure. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
You've been listening to Owning the Buy Box, a show from IP Secure. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast player. Please give us a rating, leave a comment, and share episodes that you love. That helps us keep delivering you the tools you need to sharpen your competitive edge and ensure your authorized sellers always own the buy box. We'll see you next time.